Jambo. I'm Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and Children of Kush Publications. These two organizations are dedicated to producing a paradigm shift in Black thought. Our primary objective is to challenge people of African ancestry to think outside the box of Eurocentric thought. To achieve our objectives, we try to publish articles which are circulated in the print media in Barbados, in the Caribbean, and hopefully in the future, we would like to see some of the articles reach the wider African diaspora and even onto the continent of Africa. Then we also publish videos like this one on social media. And of course, through the publishing arm of Children of Kush, there are a number of books which we also put on the market. As a matter of fact, we are currently enlarging and promoting a series which is entitled Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. Now, this series of books examine and explore many of the issues impacting on the global Black collective. The two most recent publications in that series would be Oreos, Coconuts, and Necropeans, Rediscovering Your African Identity, and The Rebirth of Black Civilization, Making Africa and the Caribbean Great Again. Now, the entire series is available online. You can either purchase as hard copies or you can download them as ebooks. To do this, you can go on the Amazon Kindle store. You can type in my author page, which is amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips. And repeat that, amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips. Or you can type in Leonard Phillips, or you can type in Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, or you can just simply type in the title of any book that you are interested in obtaining. The full listing of the books, as I said, can be found on my author page. So I'd like to encourage people to go on my author page, again, amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips, and you'll be able to see the full listing of all the books that are available. Now, to watch more videos by Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center, you go on YouTube and type in Leonard Phillips in lowercase, Leonard in lowercase, Phillips in lowercase, and look for someone who looks somewhat like me, since there are a number of different Leonard Phillips on YouTube. Now, our topic for today is a presentation which I recently did at a group, and they wanted me to talk about some of the legacies of slavery, how slavery has impacted on Black people today. So I entitled the presentation Slavery, Racism, and the Christian Church. The presentation was very well received, and I did promise the leader of the group that I would put it in, I would record the presentation and put it online so that people could see what exactly we discuss in that discussion. We're going to take a break at this point. When I come back, I will go right into the presentation for today. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get right into our subject for today, which, as I said a little earlier, we're talking about slavery, racism, and the Christian church. Now, the objective of this presentation is to explore how slavery has impacted on the global Black collective, how it impacted the people who experienced slavery. And then we want to look at some of the legacies. How did the experience of our enslaved African ancestors, how did their experience affect us living today? Is there any way in which their experience has filtered down to us living in today's world? And then we also want to explore the role played by the Christian church. We want to look at whether the Christian church was in opposition to the institution of slavery and the racism of the day that accompanied slavery, or whether the church helped to reinforce and enhance the institution of slavery. So with that in mind, let's get right into the subject. Now, in 2019, the New York Times launched a project entitled the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was spearheaded by Nicole Hannah Jones, an African-American journalist, a young lady. And what the 1619 Project attempted to do was to place the consequences of slavery and many of the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the American narrative. The contributors to the 1619 Project, there were a number of different writers, including Nicole Hannah Jones, who contributed to the articles which made up the 1619 Project. And what these contributors did, they looked at several aspects of life in America and explored how slavery impacted on these aspects of life in America. Now, here in the Caribbean, we are still grappling with our legacy of slavery, which continues to impact us in the areas of health, access to wealth, our concept of self, our ability to assert ourselves in the international arena. These are just some of the ways in which the legacy of slavery still has an impact on us. Recently, I looked at a video by Dr. Hilary Beckles, in which Dr. Hilary Beckles made the alarming statement that during the course of the enslavement of our ancestors, that we were genetically modified and made more susceptible to certain diseases. And he looked at the diet that most of our ancestors were forced to subsist on, high levels of salt, high levels of sugar, and of course, the situation of slavery was a very, very high stressed institution. And so when you combine slavery, which was high stress, when you combine a diet which was very rich in salt, very rich in sugar, in some cases, many of our enslaved ancestors were very malnourished. That laid the foundation for quite a bit of sickness. And it has been noted that the survival rate of slaves was very short. And so slaves had to be replaced on a regular basis because so many of them died, especially within the first 3 years of their experience in the world that was new to the Europeans. Now, just how badly did the institution of slavery affect our ancestors? And what was done unto them? How did it affect us today? Let's look at the horrors of slavery, starting with the raids in Africa itself. Now, it is to the shame of Africans that slavery did actually start on the African continent. where our ancestors were captured. Most authorities believe that our ancestors came mainly from West Africa and from Central Africa. And it was very unfortunate that there were many tribes in both West Africa and Central Africa who cooperated with the Europeans and facilitated the Europeans in their desire to get enslaved Africans. So many Africans would act as proxies for the Europeans, and they themselves would capture fellow Africans and then sell the fellow Africans to the European slave traders. As I said, most of our ancestors would have come from West Africa or Central Africa. This means that we could have blood ties with people from places like Ghana, Benin, Gambia, Liberia, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Cote d'Ivoire. And then in Central Africa, you have places like Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Now, slave raiders would have raided villages in all of these countries, capturing Africans and marching them across the continent to the west coast of Africa, where these unfortunate captive Africans were locked in dungeons until the next ship arrived to transport them across the Atlantic, where they would then be forced to work in labor camps or concentration camps, which were euphemistically called plantations. And of course, this was the beginning of the Black Holocaust. It's interesting, I came across an interesting book by, I think he's a Korean. His name is Ha Jung Chang. The title of the book is Bad Samaritans. And what Ha Jung Chang argues in the book Bad Samaritans is that Europeans basically act like bad Samaritans by they would do something to enrich themselves, whether it was human trafficking or drug trafficking. And then after they had made a fortune, then they would seek to pass laws to stop other nations from following suit and doing the same thing. So if you look today, you find that it is Europeans who were in the forefront of passing international laws against human trafficking, passing laws against drug trafficking. But if you know the history of many of the big businesses in Europe, you would know that many of them had their start in human trafficking. Just this morning, I was reading Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and he pointed out that Barclays Bank did have its origin in slavery. And of course, the trade in opium was another very lucrative form of business that many Europeans were involved in, and that money was then channeled into what was then considered to be more legitimate forms of business. But then, of course, after profiting significantly by human trafficking and drug trafficking, now you find that Europeans are some of the foremost advocates for no human trafficking, which is good, by the way. And of course, they're very opposed to the trafficking in drugs. And so that is why they're referred to as bad Samaritans in the book. Interestingly, the Glasgow Climate Conference that passed not too long ago, one of the arguments that is being put forward by India and China is that the Western powers, the European Western powers, use coal, gas, and oil to fuel their own economic and industrial development. Now China and India are trying to do the same thing. The West is asking China and India not to follow the same path that they followed. And of course, that's going to be a very hard sell for both China and India. So it is highly unlikely that any agreements that were reached at Glasgow will in fact be followed through. As Greta Thunberg said, the conference was just a lot of blah, 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 a lot of old talk, which full of sound and fury, but signifying very, very little in terms of real achievement. Now, conservative estimates would have us to believe that there were about between 10 to 12 million Africans who were captured and forcibly sent abroad to work in the concentration camps in the New World, in the Caribbean, South America, and in North America. Now, this figure of 10 to 12 million is contested by many Black scholars who believe that the numbers were significantly higher than this 10 to 12 million. Of course, the 10 to 12 million figure would not include those who were killed in the initial slave raids to get enslaved Africans in the first place. Then, of course, there were those who died on the overland trail. Sometimes these overland trails would be as much as 1,000 miles. You'd have to travel right across from Central Africa right to the West Coast. And very often slaves would try to escape their captivity. Many of them would be killed. Sometimes competing raiding parties would also attack caravans who were traveling to the coast. Of course, these people who died on this overland trail would not have been included in the 10 to 12,000. Then when they got to the coast in the dungeon, sometimes it would take weeks before a ship came to transport them across the Atlantic. And while they were in the dungeons, as they were cramped in these conditions, in sanitary conditions, or inhospitable conditions, many of the slaves would also have died in these slave dungeons. Elmina Castle in Ghana is one of the famous, they call it a castle, but really it was a dungeon to hold our enslaved ancestors until a ship arrived. And then, of course, you had the Middle Passage. Now, Lerone Bennett, in his book, Before the Mayflower, makes a very interesting statement. He said that so many Africans died on the passage across the Atlantic from Africa, the Middle Passage. He said that it was reported that sharks used to follow these slave ships because of the rich buffet of dead Africans that were thrown overboard. So the African Holocaust, which started somewhere in the 16th century and continues even right today. We have an idea of the number of Jews who were killed in the 12 years of hell on earth that they suffered in Germany. We have a figure of 6 million, but I don't think there is an adequate estimate of the number of Africans who lost their lives as a result of this horrendous trading in human bodies and souls, which we call chattel slavery. Now, just imagine as an enslaved African, you survived the initial slave raids, you survived the trek from Central Africa or wherever you were captured in Africa to the coast of Africa. You survive the period of waiting in the dungeons, you survive the Middle Passage, the horrors of the Middle Passage. And now you have arrived in the land that hitherto had been new to the Europeans. And the very first thing that happens as you arrived in either whether it was in the Caribbean or whether it was in Brazil or any other South American country or in North America, when enslaved African ancestors arrived, they were stripped of whatever clothing they had. Probably many of them were not wearing clothing for the entire journey across from wherever they were captured. And they were greased down and dehumanized in every single way. And the process of dehumanization, there was a purpose to it. What Europeans basically, the narrative that they pushed was that Africans were not humans. They were not human beings. And so the dehumanization of our African ancestors was designed to reinforce the message that they were not human beings. It was no different than a horse or pig or sheep. And they were paraded at the slave auctions, and people would come and they would look at the teeth, they would look at whatever they fancied in a slave. And of course, that would be the process that would determine who was bought and how much was paid for who. And so after the slave auction, the next experience for our enslaved African ancestors would have been the plantations or wherever they were forced to work in the New World. Now, Africans were brought to the New World for one purpose. I'd like to make the point that we were not brought, our ancestors were not brought to the Caribbean or to South America or North America to be the best that they could be at anything. They were not brought to be exposed to the wonders of Western civilization, as some people tell us. Neither were they brought here to be exposed to the true God, as the Europeans would say that they had the true God and the true religion. They did not bring our ancestors to expose them to any true God or any true religion. Our enslaved African ancestors were brought to the Caribbean for one purpose and one purpose alone. And that was to work like beasts of burdens from can't see morning to can't see night. That was the basic purpose. They were brought here to be cogs in the capitalist machinery of the West to help develop wealth for Caucasians. And so to ensure that Africans fulfill their central role of being a free source of labor to help develop wealth for Europeans, a system of break-in took place. There was a systematic program to break in the slaves to make sure that they perform their duties as was expected. Those of you who watched the movie Roots would recall how Kunta Kinte was beaten and terrorized simply to give up his African name, Kunta Kinte. Now, Kunta Kinte was a very meaningful name. When he said, I am Kunta Kinte, he was basically saying, I am Kunta. I am of the clan of Kente, which was a subclan of the Mandinkans. So his name told him something about his roots, who his people were, where he was from, what was expected of him as a man who was a part of the clan of the Mandinkans. That was all tied into his name. Europeans, however, wanted the Africans to forget everything about their past lives in Africa, including their names. And so Africans were beaten and forced to adopt new names, names which represented a departure, a breakage from their cultural heritage. And this, of course, you would know is one of the tried and tested steps in a program of brainwashing. And so our enslaved African ancestors were put through this brainwashing program, this systematic program of terrorization, and it was designed to break them down, to remove as much as possible of the African essence from our African ancestors so that a new personality could be developed. And this new personality would then become a tool in the hands of Europeans. Now, the most dangerous person on the plantations or the forced labor camps or the concentration camps, or whatever you would want to call them, were newly arrived Africans who still maintain a knowledge of the history, the language, the culture, and their religion. They were the most unmanageable slaves because they had a living memory of what it meant to be free Africans. These were the individuals who were most likely to start slave revolts in the New World. Now, Creole Blacks or Blacks who were born in the Caribbean also participated in slave revolts. but it was usually the African-born slaves or the African-born enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and in the New World who were in the forefront of many of these slave revolts in the New World. Here's a quote from a book by Dr. Hilary Beckles. It's called Black Rebellion, page 57. And Hilary Beckles wrote, and I quote, "African practices which hinder the formation of a regimented work attitude had to be eradicated, and to this end rewards were offered for those who came most in line with the planters' concept of the ideal worker. The system offered rewards for those who manifested the least African or Neo-African cultural attributes. So most Afro-Creoles were motivated to adopt European cultural patterns." What Dr. Beckles is basically saying here is that Europeans offered a carrot and stick method. The Africans who displayed the greatest affinity or greatest attraction or attachment to European values were rewarded. And so many enslaved Africans, to get these rewards, would just jettison or throw away many of their African cultural practices. They would get rid of their names, they would adopt Christian names, they would adopt Western dress, they would adopt Western food, and they would adopt, try to speak the language, whether it was in the British colonies, English, in the French colonies, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, adopting these languages. And so as the enslaved Africans adopted the European way of being, there were certain rewards. And so many Africans gave up their African essence just to get these rewards and to obviously try to make life easier for themselves. Now, every known psychological trick in the book was used against enslaved Africans to make them forget and despise their African heritage. They were forbidden to practice their African religion and culture. Survival was closely associated with the acceptance of all things European. Any enslaved African who continued to be too African was punished until, like Kunta Kinte, they broke and accepted their new European identity. Now we're on the point of how Africans were broken and what was done to make them forget their African identity. Recently, I was doing some research, and one of the things that Europeans feared most about our African ancestors was the religion, because they got to realize that the Africans were on to something. The voodoo and the obe had very serious implications for Europeans, because they recognized that our African ancestors, they understood how to poison and how to manipulate spiritual forces, which could then be used against the European captors. And so many laws were passed outlawing all forms of African spirituality. The drum was outlawed. Black people could not congregate unless there was a white person present. They weren't supposed to have anything to do with their own religion. Any person found practicing African religion, initially they could have been executed or transported out of the colony to another colony. And this criminalization of African spirituality basically continued right down into the period after emancipation. African religion was still outlawed. Those who are familiar with the history of the Spiritual Baptist faith would know that in Trinidad, the Spiritual Baptist faith was persecuted significantly by the colonial authorities. Then in Jamaica, when you had the rise of Rastafarianism, Leonard Howell, and the other Afrocentric groups that emerged in Jamaica, these were also persecuted significantly by the colonial authorities. Now, the interesting thing I find here is that after independence, one would have thought that the Black governments of the Caribbean would have decriminalized African spirituality, but rather than decriminalizing African spirituality, many Black governments in the Caribbean continue to maintain on the statute books laws that made it a criminal offense to practice African spirituality. And I think that is something that Caribbean governments should hang their head in shame, to think that the white people or the Caucasians, they pass laws against our enslaved African ancestors practicing their religion. And now that Black people are ruling in the Caribbean, rather than rescinding and striking these laws off the books, we have a situation where these laws are maintained on the book. And really and truly, if you listen to the attitude of many Caribbean peoples, you would find that we have imbibed some of the same anti-Black attitudes as the Europeans with respect to the religion of our ancestors. If you listen to people in the Caribbean talk about voodoo or obey, you get to realize that we are as anti-Black in our bias against the spirituality of our African ancestors as were the Europeans. It's interesting also to note that it took an Indian government in Trinidad to actually make life easier for the spiritual Baptists and the Orisha Shangos in Trinidad, whereas the Black governments were dragging their foot. It was an Indian government, I think under Mr. Pandey, who gave the Shango Baptists a holiday in Trinidad. And I think he also gave them a grant of land, which was very commendable on the part of Mr. Pandey. He did what the Black Trinidad government refused to do. Let's talk a little bit about family life. Remember, we're trying to look at some of the legacies. Now, in some jurisdictions, slaves were allowed to marry, and this was mainly in the Catholic jurisdictions, since marriage was one of the sacraments of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church seemed a little bit more serious about the whole conversion to Catholicism thing than the Protestant. Many Catholics attempted to encourage enslaved Africans to marry rather than continuing to practice their freer style of interacting with the opposite sex. But of course, since a slave was property, it meant that slaves could be sold at any time by their masters. And so many parent would be forcibly separated from a child. And in some jurisdictions, that parent may never again have seen the child. And so because of the fluidity of family relations, one can imagine that many Black families were very fragile in terms of their composition. And sociologists who look at what happened in slavery and then look at some comparisons among Black family life would no doubt find some correlation between attitudes that may have developed among Black people during the period of enslavement and attitudes that are prevalent among Black people in our supposed freedom. Now, Europeans justified their inhuman treatment of enslaved Africans on the grounds that slavery was ordered and it was actually recommended by the Bible. Secondly, Africans were descendants of Ham and could therefore be enslaved by Jews and Caucasians. If one goes back to the biblical story of Ham and the curse of Noah, you would find that Ham, his son Canaan, it was said that Canaan would be a servant of Shem and Japheth. In other words, he would be a servant of Jews or Semites, and Japheth, which would be the Caucasian people. Others, another justification of slavery was that Africans were cursed by God to be servants of others. And therefore, Europeans were just fulfilling the divine will. If God intended that Black people should be servants of other people, then white people and Jews and others who enslaved Africans were just simply following the divine plan. And last and most terrible of all the reasons was the idea that Africans were subhuman. In other words, they were not a part of the human family. And it is interesting to note that many Caucasian religionists went so far as to say that if a Black person had sex with a white person, it was kind of like a person having sex with an animal. And so lots of laws were passed to prevent white people from having sex with Black people on the grounds that it was a form of bestiality. That is how low Black people were regarded. And I'm not talking now about secular Europeans, I'm talking about Christians. It was Christians who basically pushed this line of reasoning. Now, here's another quote from another book by Dr. Hilary Beckles, this time Great House Rules, page 67. Dr. Hilary Beckles writes, he said, John Braffett, the rector of St. John Anglican Church, was among the 5 largest slave owners on the island. The church was corrupted by the culture of slavery and was one of its most important advocates. So the Anglican Church in Barbados owned slaves. They had their own plantations. And one of the interesting things I came across when I was researching the topic was the idea that the Anglicans and in some cases the Catholic Church, who also had slave plantations, said the reason why the church got into setting up plantations was to set an example for the rest of the white planters as to how they should treat their slaves. There's an interesting video circulating online, the church owned slaves. I think that's the title of the video. And in it, it showed that in Barbados, that the Anglican Church not only had plantations, but rather than being exemplary, we find that people who were Africans who were very young were employed, so they were child labor, and then those who were very old. So they were not above the Anglican Church, or the church of the day was not above exploiting the very young or the very old. Well, so much for setting an example for the rest of the secular society. The churches during the slavery period and long after were controlled by Europeans. Churches worked closely with the plantocracy to help maintain the system of slavery. White church leaders shared the same racist views that were held by the plantation owners. Church leaders supported segregation of the races, even within church service. There was a color system of seating in the churches. Blacks were seated at the back of the church, or in some cases, what tidbits of gospel that Black people heard, they had to hear it through the windows of the church, since there were many instances where they were not allowed into the building itself. Now, honorary mention should be made of the Quakers, who were totally opposed to slavery. It should be mentioned, just for clarity's sake, that the Quakers did not start off as being anti-slavery. The Quakers, like all other Christian institutions, were involved in slavery. Barclays Bank, as I mentioned a little earlier, that was a bank that was started by Quakers, and the founders of the Barclays Bank, 2 of the brothers who were Quakers, were also deeply involved in the institution of slavery as well. But eventually, Quakers in, I think it was North America, it was the North American branch of the Quakers who then started to push for the ending of slavery. Now, remember when the Mormons first came to Barbados, the Christian community led by the evangelicals of Barbados led a smear campaign against the Mormons, claiming that the Mormons were racist against Black people. Now, what the evangelicals were saying about the Mormons basically had a lot of truth in it. The Mormons did teach that Black skin was the result of a divine curse. As early as 1852, Brigham Young, who succeeded Joseph Smith, held that Black people should not be admitted to the priesthood. Not only they couldn't be admitted to the priesthood, but they could not participate in Mormon temple endowments or sealing ordinances. So that was a settled fact in Mormonism, that Black people could not be elevated to the Mormon priesthood, neither could they participate in Mormon temple endowments or sealing ordinances. Now, the experience of the Mormons and Black people is kind of nuanced, because in my research, I discovered that Joseph Smith, he kind of, at one point, he was anti-slavery. Then at another point, he seemed to be pushing the idea of slavery. Joseph Smith, prior to the announcement that Black people could not be a part of the Mormon priesthood, Joseph Smith apparently had elevated a Black man to be a Mormon priest. And of course, this came to an end with the ruling in 1852 by Brigham Young. Now, from 1852 to 1978, Blacks were barred from the Mormon priesthood and from the temple endowment sealing ordinances in the Mormon church. However, in 1978, the leader of the Mormons, Spencer W. Kimball, had a revelation in which he said that this would no longer be the case. And since 1978, Black Mormons have been allowed into the Mormon priesthood, as well as into the Mormon temple endowment and sealing ordinances. So the Mormons have attempted to clean house and to correct some of their mistakes in the past. One wonders, of course, if the Spirit could lead Spencer W. Kimball in 1978 to renounce racist attitudes, while the same Spirit did not teach Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all the Mormon leaders subsequently that racism and preventing Black people from higher levels in their church was wrong, simply because of the Blackness of their skin. Now, what the evangelicals missed or conveniently left out of their smear campaign against the Mormons, however, was the idea that all Christian denominations, bar none, started out with a certain amount of anti-Blackness. Because when you really stop to think about the theology of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, you will find that there is an anti-Black element within the religion itself. As a matter of fact, the Bible, if you really stop to think about it, that's the basis of the theology of excluding Blacks from the Mormon ministry. They say that Cain, a part of his curse, the mark of Cain was blackness of skin. Or if you don't want to go with that one from the Mormons, you hear the other Christian denominations making the point about the curse of Ham. So it is all rooted in the religious systems of these white Europeans. Now let's look at another Christian organization. We talked about Anglicans, we talked about Mormons. So let's talk a little bit about Seventh-day Adventists. Seventh-day Adventists have a very interesting history where race relations are concerned. Now, the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church were, in fact, anti-slavery. That's a fact. That cannot be disputed in any way. The first General Conference president of the Seventh-day Adventists, John Byington, was an active abolitionist. U.S. Smith attacked religious leaders of his day for their role in the suffering of America's slave population. So you find among the pioneers some very strong advocates against slavery. In 1862, James White wrote, and I quote, he said, "For the past 10 years, the review has thought that the United States of America was a subject of prophecy, and that slavery is pointed out in the prophetic word as the darkest and most damning sin upon this nation. It has thought that heaven has wrath in store for the nation, which it would bring to the very dregs as due punishment for the sins of slavery." Now, that's a very strong talk there from James White, where he said, recalls slavery, the darkest and most damaging sin upon the American nation. And he intimated that there would be divine judgment on North America because of the sin of slavery. Another very positive thing that happened in the Adventism when the American government passed the fugitive slave laws, I think it was in the 1950s, Ellen White Council, who was the prophetess to the Adventists, she advised Adventists to practice civil disobedience. They were not supposed to deliver up slaves to their masters, which I think was also very commendable. But when one says A, you also have to say B. Now, the same Ellen White wrote some statements which were very hard to digest from a racial perspective. As a Black person, I have great problems with some of these statements which Ellen White wrote. Like, for example, when she made mention in one of her books that some races are the amalgamation of man and beast. And of course, when critics of Adventism and critics of Ellen White called upon Ellen White to explain what she meant when she said that some races were an amalgamation of man and beast. One of the noted defenders of Adventism in the person of U.S. Smith made mention of, he talked about the Dagger Indians, he talked about the Khoi or the Hottentots, and he talked about the Bushmen of the Kalahari. You'll notice that those are two Black tribes that he mentioned, are two Black ethnic groups and an Indian ethnic group, all with dark skin color. So it seems to me that Ellen White and those around her seem to have been nursing the idea that some Black people were subhuman. And I've raised this point with many Adventists in many of their forums, and none of them have been able to give me a satisfactory answer. Some have said that Ellen White did not really mean that human beings were having sex with animals and producing these amalgamated races, which U.S. Smith identified as some of the darker skinned races, the Hottentots and the Bushmen. They said, no, that's not what she meant. What she was talking about was intermarriage between one group of people and another group of people. But again, we have a bit of trouble there, because why would one race of people marrying into another race, what we call interracial marriage, why would that mar the image of God? Because she said that it was amalgamation which marred the image of God and brought about the wrath of God resulting in the flood. That's what Ellen White taught in her book, Spiritual Volumes, I think volume 3, I think it is. That is what she said. So if you're going to talk about intermarriage, that people were intermarrying, or it was, as some people say, the sons of God seeing the daughters of men, meaning that you had some people who were faithful and then other people who were not faithful. And it was that intermingling of the two groups of people, spiritual and unspiritual, that resulted in the corruption of humanity. If that is the point, then one must wonder about the whole instance of Moses. Moses married an Ethiopian. Joseph married the daughter of an Egyptian high priest. that would have been intermarriage. Samson married a Philistine, and the Bible makes it clear that the marriage was of the Lord because God wanted there to be friction between Samson and the Philistine. So it was of the Lord. So if perchance intermarriage was what Ellen White meant, then we have some difficulties, especially when you realize that she talked about the amalgamation of beasts as well, where the beasts marrying or where the beasts having sex with unconverted beasts. All of these are questions that are raised, and I think the Adventist Church did a very good thing by not continuing to publish these statements. When Ellen White wrote Patriarchs and Prophets, a little later, she did not include this amalgamation statement because it's a very hard statement to defend. It's a statement that ranks of racism of the worst order. Now, after the death of the early Adventist pioneers, the Adventist Church took a U-turn on racial matters. They started off strongly abolitionist, but then we find that by the time you have the introduction of Jim Crow in North America, separate but equal, we find the church following the lead of the secular society. And so we had a situation where Seventh-day Adventists followed basically all the other denominations in terms of practicing Jim Crow laws. Calvin Rock, who is a Black Adventist writing in North America, in his book, Protest and Progress, makes this observation. He said, "But while these and other early leaders were socially liberal, their successors were not. They were not only socially conservative, but they also saw to it that church policies and practices conformed to the racially restrictive ideology of the time." So whereas before the pioneers were, as Calvin Rock said, socially liberal, the church eventually evolved into a socially conservative church, which basically followed the lead of the secular society. With the advent of Jim Crow or segregation in the US, we find the Adventist Church conforming to the racist practices of the American state. Black Adventists were paying their tithe, which was being used to build institutions that Black people could not enter. Then, of course, there was the Lucille Bayard affair, in which a Black Seventh-day Adventist was refused treatment at the Washington Sanitarium, and she later died. Now, when Black Adventists became aware that this faithful Black Seventh-day Adventist lady had been refused treatment at the Washington Sanitarium, that kind of acted as the catalyst for Black Adventists then to make the bold decision that no longer did they want to be under the white conferences. And so what you had developing in North America were what were called then regional conferences or Black conferences, where Black people then collected their own tithe and built their own institutions. And of course, I thought that was a very good move on the part of Black Adventists in North America. Now, the coldness of the Seventh-day Adventist Church administration to the civil rights movement led Pastor C.D. Brooks of Breath of Life fame to comment. And he said, I quote, "Something dreadfully negative has happened to us. Though we have a heritage of justice and courage from our Adventist pioneers, we seem to have forgotten it. Our present blindness is simply out of keeping with the heroic facts of our past." So Pastor Brooks, or the late Pastor Brooks, is affirming that something went dreadfully wrong in terms of Adventist attitude and practice where racial justice was concerned. Now, I tend to agree with Calvin Rock, who in the conclusion of his book, Protest and Progress, stated, and I quote, "Even when the governments are manifestly socially oppressive, groups that claim to have a prophetic mission are seldomly prophetic in addressing social change. Change usually occurs when and if their governments initiate it, and even their conservative religionists tend to follow afar off. So even after Separate but Equal was disbanded in the US, you still found that the Adventist Church was lagging behind in terms of opening its institutions to Black people. As a matter of fact, the secular state of the US has had a Black president in Barack Obama. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has never had a Black president, even though people of color constitute the majority of members within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So let's conclude. Let's look at some of the points in our conclusion. Let's look at some of the points that I made in this presentation. He said that the institution of slavery had many effects on Black people. Number one, it robbed the African continent of millions of its best and brightest people. It set African ethnic groups against each other and got them involved in the capturing and sale of their fellow Africans to European slave traders. Number three, the institution of slavery robbed the enslaved Africans of their native homeland, their language, their culture, their history, their customs, their religion, their folkways, their mores. Number four, the institution of slavery robbed enslaved Africans of their dignity and the unique African personhood. Number five, the institution of slavery forced enslaved Africans to hate themselves, to hate their own blackness of skin. Number six, the institution of slavery was supported by most Christian denominations, if not by all of them. Number seven, Christian church leaders were also slave owners and benefited from the wealth generated by the exploitation of enslaved Africans. Number eight, the Quakers deserve honorary mention for being one of the first Christian denominations to oppose slavery and to advocate the abolition of slavery. Number nine, Seventh-day Adventists started out as a staunchly anti-slavery organization, but eventually drifted into the same racist practices that characterize most Christian denominations. So as we conclude now, I come to what is the takeaway from all of this. Number one, Black people must reject the racist propaganda that attempts to create the impression that Black people are in any way inferior to Caucasians or to any other race. Black people are not inferior to Caucasians. We're not inferior to Indians. We're not inferior to Chinese. We're not inferior to Japanese. We're not inferior to anyone. As a matter of fact, we have proven time and time again, when given the opportunity to compete, we will do better than many of the other ethnic groups. It is unfair to put chains on a man's foot and then telling him he's slow, that he can't keep up, when everybody else is running without chains. That is what Europeans did. They put chains on Black people's feet and then told them to run with everybody else, and then laughed at us because we were a little slower. Once the chains are removed, once the obstacles are removed, we can climb to the heights that any other ethnic group has reached. And I dare say we will surpass, because when we as an ethnic group do things, we do it with class, we do it with style. We do things in a way that others want to emulate and to fashion their own practice after ours. So we're not inferior in any way to any other ethnic group. So that's one takeaway. Second takeaway is that Black people need to stop looking to Caucasian or to others for solutions to Black problems, as Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad are on record stating that Black people need to learn to do for self. We can't sit back and wait on other people to do for us what we need to do for ourselves. Number three, Black people need to rediscover our African essence. And stop trying to be Caucasian, stop trying to be Jewish, stop trying to be Arabs, stop trying to be any other ethnic group. We are a people of African ancestry. We are Black. We should be proud of that fact. We should be happy to claim our African ancestry, claim our African heritage, claim our African names, claim our African religion, claim that which is uniquely ours, and build a civilization then based on our African essence. And number 4, Black people need to reconnect with a genuine African spirituality. I remember when we had the discussion, I started by asking the group, what happens when a Jew, a European, or an Arab goes to either synagogue, church, or mosque? And in our discussion, we concluded that when the Jew goes to church, the Jew is learning Jewish history. He's learning Jewish culture, Jewish religion. He's learning about the Jewish God. He's even learning a bit of the Jewish language because the Torah is written in Hebrew. And so to fully appreciate the subtleties of the Old Testament, the Jew is taught the Hebrew language. So when the Jew goes to church, he is being reinforced into his own history, his own culture, his own language. When the Europeans, who may not have started any religion, but as we all know, they appropriated Judaism and they appropriated Christianity. So we find that in the European context, we find everybody in the European Bible is a European. Abraham is pictured as a European. Moses is a European. Everybody is a European. Jesus is a European. God is a European. The angels are European. The only person who perhaps is not a European in the Europeanized version of Christianity is the devil. And we all know why that is. So when the white European goes to church, he is also learning about his history, about his culture, about his religion. As a matter of fact, most of the Bibles were either in Greek or in Roman. When you talk about Greece and Rome, you are talking about the two civilizations that Europe goes back to find its historical roots. So they go back to their origins. They know the history. They go back to studying their history, Greece and Rome. That affirms them. Just like the Jews, Christians also believe, the European Christians also believe that they were specially chosen by God. That's the whole rationale behind the concept of the white man's burden. He believes that he has been given a job from the Creator to expand the glories of European civilization and European religion to the very ends of the world. And the same thing with the Muslim, the Arab. When the Arab goes to mosque, he is learning his own history, his own culture, his own language. He's also learning something about his unique role in the whole scheme of things. Unfortunately, when the Black person goes to synagogue, to church, or to mosque, that is the same thing that he's learning. Black people learn nothing about themselves. We learn nothing about our culture out of our religious experience. We learn nothing about the unique African spirituality. We learn nothing about African languages. We learn nothing about ourselves. And then we wonder why it is that other people seem to be doing so well, and we not so much so. Maybe it has to do with the way how we are being taught, the way how we are being conditioned. The Jewish prophets, the European religionists, the Muslims, the Arabs, they speak to the issues of their own ethnic groups. The Jewish prophets looked at problems facing the Jews and came up with solutions for the Jews to help move them from being the foot or from being the tail to the head, from being the last to becoming the first. And by and large, it works for Jews because Jews have been able to excel They have, in terms of Nobel Prize winners, in terms of science, in terms of entertainment, in terms of financing. Jews are right up there with the best. And I believe it has a lot to do with the fact that Jews, they have taken very seriously the injunction in the Torah that they were supposed to rehearse their history to every single generation. Every generation of Jews are supposed to learn about the history of their people, learn about their ancestors, learn their language, learn about their culture, learn about the religious festivals, learn about all of these things. Unfortunately, Black people, we are learning nothing about ourselves. And I think this is a tragedy, and I think that this is something that needs to be addressed very urgently. Black churches can no longer continue to week after week talking about Abraham and Moses and Jewish ideas and Jewish concepts and Jewish thoughts. When Black people are suffering, there are problems that Black people are having that need to be addressed. And the church, that's where most Black people can be found in sizable numbers. That's where we need to be discussing the problems that are facing the Black community. So I hope that this presentation would have stimulated your desire to know a little bit more about your history as a Black person, to know a little bit more about your culture, know a little bit more about the folkways and the mores, know a little bit more about the spirituality of your African ancestors. And most of all, I'm going to end on this point, find that every group of people, the Creator has spoken and has raised up men and women to lead every ethnic group to a higher stage of their evolution. And the same thing is true for Black people. We have had some luminaries who have risen up in our midst, who have taught us how we can become a great people. But the unfortunate thing is, we are not studying our own prophets. We're studying the prophets of other people. We're studying the thought leaders of other people who are speaking to their own particular group. We need to spend time looking at those people who speak to the issues of people of African ancestry so that we too can solve many of our problems and grow to become the great people that we can become. Asante sana na kwaheri, which is Kish Swahili for thank you very much and goodbye.